Hello, everybody, and welcome back. This is going to be a video on what I am calling Pro Tips for Fluid Simulations. And it's basically just a gathering of tips and tricks that I have learned over the years that help me create fluid simulations for still frame or for animation. So hopefully you can get something out of this and make a really great fluid simulation for your next project. So the first thing that I would recommend before even getting started with one of these projects is, however cool this may look to you and all that, there's a lot of work that goes into it and you're going to need a lot of patience. So my first tip to you is that you need to go into this knowing that it's going to take you time and that depending on your computer, you might need to leave it to bake out your simulations over possibly a full day or hours or something like that just to get a decent simulation and not even your final. For a final, you really should have a high resolution division for your original liquid simulation. And then when it comes to creating your mesh, you might have to then, after you have your particle field, you might have to then figure out some ways to uh, experiment with what kind of look you're going for, what size of particles you need to create for the mesh to take the shape that you want it to be. You need to decide at a certain point whether or not you're going to have splash particles or not, or spray particles or bubble particles. These are all things that you're going to have to need to decide at a certain point. But when you're just doing I would call this a basic simulation here, then I would definitely recommend that you understand, or any of these, I would recommend that you understand that you need to have patience when it comes to creating any of these. It will take you time, but if you do have some patience, you can create something that looks really, really awesome. There's nothing worse than when you are creating your project that you run out of room. And that goes for your final render. It goes for when you are creating the mesh particle system for your simulation like this here. And it goes for any sort of textures you're creating. And when you bake out your final fluid simulation for the mesh animation here. And basically, what I mean is if we look at this project here, and if I look at how much space this used, it's 58 gigabytes. Now, the one of the reasons for this is that I created an animation, which you can check out here. You can look at the card that just came in above. I created a water simulation that I wanted to show some different steps of how to do some visual effects changes, background replacements, things like that. So if we go inside of here and we just look at the render, you can see that there's 27.2 gigabytes that was used. So half of the file is with rendered images, and you can see that there's some practice or sample renders that I did here for a paint splash sort of look, and there's a couple that I did here. But you can see here that I have a whole bunch of different stuff. So this EXR set just on its own is about 5.5 gigabytes, and I have all these other things here that show the viewport render and all sorts of things. So for the render, at least on my side, that was half of it. But you can see here that with the fluid mesh, this is the cache fluid here. So this is the particles and the mesh data. You can see this 21.4 gigabytes. And then the final baked out fluid mesh here, you can see that that's 9.19. So when we were able to get to the point of baking out our final mesh, it is a lot smaller, which is great for animations and things like that. It's a lot faster to load, but you could see that it still takes quite a bit of space here. So if you're a gamer and you have a small SSD or something like that, like 240 gigs or something, just understand that this might take a huge amount of space on your solid state hard drive. And you might want to think about, if you want to get into fluid simulations and do this on the regular, you might want to consider investing in some more hard drives. So you can see here I have a 980 Pro. This is my other working hard drive that I got, and it's almost empty. There's some stuff here that I've saved some things to, but it's almost empty compared to everything else. And I could get rid of a lot of this stuff here and put it on one of my other mechanical hard drives just to back it up. But I got this solid state drive because I knew that I could run out of space on my working drive, which is this one here. So I was thinking ahead and I got this one in order for me to basically just make sure that I didn't run out of room in the middle of a project if it was paid for or anything else. So make sure that you keep your hard drives clean and that you back up all your information, that you have enough on a either removable drive or on your hard drives that you have installed on your computer just to make sure that you don't run out of room. You should export your mesh as a final Alembic file, an animated mesh, which is basically what that is. So if we go over here and we look at the water simulation, you can see that I have all this stuff here. I have a water emission, which are these two guys right here. And we have the liquid domain, which is all of this simulation right here. And I have some Bezier circles in here, which I use to do some other things. So when you do your water simulation, you're ready to either send it to a client or you're sending it to another VFX artist or something like that. What you really should do is save out this mesh data as an animated mesh. You should not really send a file that has the baked session unless you need someone else to fine tune some of the stuff that you have in your fluid simulation as far as the settings are concerned. What you should be sending either into well, you have to, if you're sending it into another program like Unreal Engine, which a lot of people are using for rendering now because it does live real time ray tracing and stuff like that, or if you're sending it to somebody else because it's part of a group project that you're working on, you need to be able to know how to export your mesh data. So, what you need to do is select your mesh, and let's just turn on this here. So, you want to select the mesh that you want exported, which for us is the liquid domain, file, export, and then you want to go to the Alembic right here. And you need to make a file. I already have one here. Name it whatever your project is. So this is just called Apple One Fluid. You can check these or uncheck them however you'd like. And then you can export your Alembic file. So what that will do is it will create your data file here, and when you import it, it's going to look like this. And we can actually more easily play this in time and see what's going on because it's not calculating out all those particle effects. You could then take this mesh data here and add some modifiers to it rather easily. So if we take a modifier here and let's just say add a smooth to it, and we take a look, you can see that we can then smooth this down however we'd like, or add a subdivision surface modifier if it seems too bumpy or something like that. You can do all sorts of things to this from this point, and it's now an animated mesh. You can see here that there is a time scale. So the time scale, my opinion is that when you're doing fluid simulations, usually what I have noticed is that if you lower the time scale to halftime or even smaller, you can get a more detailed splash because it's calculating the information at a slower rate. And in post, you could then increase the speed of your simulation. Let's say that you did this at half time. You could then speed it up in your compositing or in your edit when you do it later. You can just speed this up to, 150% or 200%. And you'll get a lot more of a detailed splash effect where you won't see as distracting of if you've ever seen these before, a lot of times the particles that are in here will sort of wobble around if you don't have as detailed of a resolution division. Sometimes they can wobble around either on the object that you have it interacting with right here, or when it splashes like this, it can have this sort of like weird effect. If you do change the time scale down to even lower than what I did here, you could do really cool effects where you sort of like start with a fast motion when it like right before it hits the object, and then you can slow it down. Maybe you started at 60 frames per second instead of 30. It hits the object, and then you slow it down to 30 frames per second, and you won't really see any problems when it comes to the actual look of it. It will look really nice and smooth. It'll look like it was intentional, and it allows you a lot more leeway when you're doing your either product rendering or anything like that, or your edit. You can make it look really, really cool, and you can um, create just a more dramatic effect by allowing yourself a little bit more time to play with that. So I would definitely recommend at least doing half time for your time scale, then speeding it up in post. The other thing here is that when you get to the liquid right here, when it comes to your kind of like how the particles sort of emit and how they work, your starting particles right here for the maximum and the minimum, it's going to be less. I think it's half this. And I would recommend that you bump this up for your final so that it has more particles, especially when you're doing a small scale sort of like scene like this where I used an apple. So that's a pretty small scale scene compared to like a large ocean or something. And usually these fluid simulations have been prioritized for large ocean scenes or something like that. So when you're trying to make it smaller, you really should have more particles so that you can keep the sort of like the sheeting effect together. So these here can stay together more, and you can have more of a solid effect and wave sort of pattern going on here. The other thing here is right here where it says narrow band width. The larger this is, the more that it allows for a sort of like sheeting effect, kind of like this right here. So the higher this number, the more you can see here a thicker band and more particles. So it's going to keep together a lot more on the edges, which is better for things like paint effects or viscosity, or if you want a really cool slow motion water effect where you can see all the sheeting of the water, which, it could be called unnatural, but it looks really cool. You're going to want to increase that value there. If we drill down here to the particles, you can see that there's a whole bunch of stuff here: spray, foam, and bubbles. You really don't need bubbles for a small scale thing like this, but if you're doing more of a sort of water pour or a beer pour into a glass or something, you might need some bubbles. And if it's in a glass, especially, you might want to definitely have some of those bubbles there. Foam, we don't really need it for this because it's not an ocean and it's not anything that really requires a foam effect. Spray, I could have used it, but honestly, when I ran this, you could see that there's the little particle effects right up here. And sometimes when you have a spray effect, it can feel sometimes a little bit too large scale because there's just too much sort of like stuff going on. And you can see right here, I'm going to put in an image of the perfume ad that I did where you can see that there's some spray used there. And it looks really, really cool. It looks very dramatic, but for this particular scene, it didn't really work as well as I wanted it to work. And you can see there's all sorts of stuff here that you can add and alter. But I would say, if you really don't need this, don't use it because it's going to increase your the time to render and to run the simulation by a large margin. So if you can get away with it, don't use these, at least especially when you're starting off creating these really cool effects here. When you click on to start to bake your mesh out, start with an upres factor of 1 just to see what it looks like and make sure that you're actually happy with your scene. The worst thing you can do is spend your time rendering out or baking out a upres factor of 2 or 3, and it will take hours just to find out that your particle system wasn't good enough to actually constitute for that. So just be careful with these and use the upres factor of 1 first. And you can see here that the particle radius I have set at a different than the default value. And you can see here, I have it at 1.5. So that's because the particles, I wanted them to be more of a sheeting effect. And the larger the particle, if you remember, I showed you how the two different metaballs worked. The larger those particles are, the more they're going to connect together. So you might want to practice with this using the upres factor of 1. Change your particle radius if it feels like there's too many holes or something like that. Just increase your particle radius, run your mesh again, and see if that's going to help you out there. When you're running your simulation, what you really want to do is make sure that you have a good frame range that you want this to run in. If we look at this one, and if we go towards the end here, you can see that a lot of this ending scene here, or the ending part of the scene, it's just a bunch of sort of like dripping, which I wanted in the animation because I wanted to be able to show people what that looked like, because it is kind of neat. However, most people, they want a still frame of the animation where, you might want to, if I go over here, you could see that there's all this crazy splash effect. Let me see if I can move it around here. You can see how crazy the splash effect is. And if I go to the rendered view, it's not really that clear what's going on. It's kind of hard to see. And this frame is not actually a really good frame to see the splash effect if you're doing a still frame. So if I go to frame 45 and we go to the rendered view, you can see that this is a much more cool looking frame. We can actually see the bits of the sheeting here, and we can see all kinds of really cool stuff that's going on with the water simulation effect. So if this was a product render shot for a particular Apple brand, or if you have a logo in the middle or something like that, you would want to use a frame like this. So when you run your particles and you notice that the particle simulation without the mesh being run, if you notice that really you only need to get to about frame 45, and maybe you want a couple frames after to have a selection of frames to choose from, maybe just run it for 50 frames. You don't need to run it like this long. So I would recommend that you first start with maybe, frame 1 to 100 with a low resolution division set for your particles, and then once you have a good idea about what that's going to look like and what frame you want it to be on, then run your simulation up to that frame, just so that you can have the beginning stuff and you can have the part later. And then run your mesh later to see how that works. So definitely make sure that you pick the right frame range and you don't waste your time baking out frames that you're never going to use. Over here, you can see in the cache section, there's a thing that says modular. So under type, you want to, it will probably start with the replay right here. And I've noticed that when you, basically how that works is that when you press play down here and it runs over to the first frame, it's supposed to show you the water simulation and sort of show you in real time how it's baking out. But I've noticed that it really doesn't update very easily. So what you'll have to do is if you're using it on replay and you want to see a new change or something, whether you've moved an object or something like that, what you need to do is you need to actually in here you need to sort of like click up and then down the resolution divisions, just like one tick, or change a setting just really quick back and forth, and then you can replay it. So, and what I mean is like I have my emission devices up here and down here. What you might need to do is what you kind of need to do is you need to change something in the fluid, the liquid domain first, and then when it runs back around in the playhead, you can then see the update. But I often will end up just baking it, so I change it to modular, and what that does is it allows you to bake your particle system here. So you can see here the liquid part, and you can uh, bake out your particles. And then after you get your particles done, you can then bake out your mesh. And these are all done to where you can actually stop it. So I'm not going to free the data, but if you run your simulation, you can hit escape, which will pause the or stop the simulation, and then you can continue it from where you left off by clicking that button again. You'll see another button show up, and then the same thing for liquid. You will see, or the mesh down here, and then see how the simulation's running. And if you don't like it, you could free the mesh and then change a couple settings and restart it. Or you can just continue where you left off, and it will keep running your the different parts of the mesh and the liquid particle simulation depending on where you left those off. So pretty cool. So if you look here, I have this object here. You can see water emission 2, then I have water emission 1. What you really want to do is you want these not to look like they are just a solid object. You need the mesh to sort of transform a bit. Because if you leave it just normal, if you leave it just a mesh object like a sphere, you're going to end up with something that sort of has this weird sheeting effect, or this you'll kind of see the subdivisions as it's being shot out, and it won't look natural. And how you can do this, and I'll show you what happens when you have one that's sort of this effect here and then one that's not. So this one, I'll actually turn this off because this is actually how I ran the simulation, so I could show you guys how this works. So you can see here's a regular sphere or a rounded cube, and then up here, this one has a displacement effect that you can see is done over here. What I have is I have a displacement, and I'm using this object over here, and if I move this, you can see how that object is sort of animating. So I have a procedural texture that is displacing this, that makes it to where the object sort of transforms over time. And down here, this one, I don't have that on. I've turned it off, and I actually didn't run the simulation with it on, so I could show you guys how this looks. If we turn on the baked fluid to make this a little bit faster, and if I go to a beginning frame here, if we look down here, you could see how this shape looks very regular. And you could see that there's this rippling effect. Okay, you see these ripples? And if we go to the rendered view, let's turn off transparent glass really quick so you can see it. So do you see that rippling effect right there? So that rippling effect that you're seeing is going to make things look a little bit weird. And if we go to the view in the camera and we just sort of move frame by frame, there's the water simulation from the bottom, and it hits, and you could see there's that ripple effect right down in here. And so it makes more of like a sort of like a regular shape, as if it's coming out of like a tube. And that's not really as natural, and you won't get as natural of a splash. Although this does look cool, you won't get as natural of a splash by that. And if we go a little bit more forward, we can see the dripping effect from up here, and if we look at that, you can see how much more natural that looks. It looks like it is sort of like forming along as if it's being poured out of an object, instead of just this very obvious effect that's going on here. So, in my opinion, and in the experience that I've had using this, it's a lot easier to have cool effects when you have your object being hit by multiple sources for the splash, because you can have, up here it's sort of dripping down. So I get sort of this uh, downward angle set of dripping and all that. If we look at the solid mode, you can see right there, I have it just covering the top, and we also get this splash effect coming from the back. So we get kind of a cool effect by that happening. You don't have to do this, but it will increase your bake times and everything. But I do think that it does end up having a very cool effect when you have your object being hit from multiple sources. And if it's a can of soda or something like that, having a different timed can work too, where you have one hitting it from the left side, then another one hitting it from the right side, and then you'll have different timed splash effects where you'll have some drips coming closer to camera on the right side, for example, and then on the left side, you might have some going away from camera that are a little bit newer. So it can have a really cool look to it if you do that. If we go over here to my emissions and we take a look at the properties, you can see that for my fluid inflow object, I have an animation here. So in order to keep this looking really cool, where it has the splash effect, but it doesn't have a continuous flow of water where it kind of muddies up the scene, I have it animating on, then off. And what this will do is it will help save you time in your baking, because you won't have as many particles going on in your fluid simulation if you sort of ran this for the whole length of your timeline. But you get this really nice effect where it sort of like squirts the water out and then it stops. So you can have the effect run through, it does the effect, and then you have in the end the dripping sort of effect here, where it's just sort of like flowing over the object instead of continuously being hit and the flow coming down. And a lot of times that can cause some problems with people when they're creating this sort of effect. Another recommendation I'll give you is that when you're creating an effect like this, you really want your fluid to not fill up the scene. We're creating a splash animation. We don't need it to fill up anything. And if you allow it to fill up and have border collisions with the actual shape. So, another recommendation that I'm going to give you guys is that when you are running your simulation, you really need to make sure that you have the proper border collisions ticked on or ticked off for what you're trying to do. Now, I knew that when I created this animation, I wanted it just to have a splash animation. And if you keep the border collisions on, it will calculate the particles as it hits the sides or the top or the bottom, whatever it is that you've decided to tick on here. It will calculate those particles and take a lot more time. And also, you're seeing the box here will start to fill up with water or the fluid particles as it's running the simulation. Now, if you want that, that's fine. Just understand that it's going to increase the size of your scene and it's going to increase basically everything overall for you to run your simulation. So, if you're going for a splash particle effect like I did, you'll want to make sure that you have all of these unticked and just allow the simulation to just take place within the area that you want it to take place in for your render. Another recommendation I'm going to give you guys is that you need to really make sure that you, after the first couple passes of doing your water simulation, set up your composition, because you don't want to waste your time running your simulation where in your final render you're going to see the emitters. We don't want to see the emitter down here, and we don't want to see the emitter up there, and we want to make sure that when we run our animation that we can see this stuff in the composition the way that we want it to be. We don't want to run this and then be able to see that, oh no, in the bottom left, we can actually see where the water is coming from in the composition, unless that's what you want, which most people don't. So just make sure that you are setting up your composition and keeping that as part of your workflow process towards the beginning instead of at the end, which is a common mistake that people have when they're starting to either do things in CGI or they are learning the process. When you're running your simulation, what you'll really want to do, if it's an animation, is do some test renders to make sure that everything is sort of running properly. And what I don't mean is adding a whole bunch of materials, setting up your render passes and stuff like that. What I mean is you can do viewport renders that will allow you to see the particle flow. And if you're working with a client or if you're working with another CGI artist or something, you can render that out relatively quickly and send them that animation and say, hey, what do you think about the splash animation for this? Do you think that there's enough particles here? Or you could just look at it yourself and make sure that you can actually see that the animation is looking good and that there's no major hiccups in the particles before you run your mesh or before you run a final resolution for your scene. And how you can do that is if you go over to your output properties, make sure that you have a set output properties path and that you set it up right here. You can see that I have these little, people call them hashtags now, but these little number signs. This allows a thing called padding, which means that it will give you a digit number for the frame. I'm going to hit cancel here. And what you can do if you set up as a JPEG down here, which is what I have it set up as a JPEG, and make sure I have it at 150%, so that's a 2K render right here. If you're just doing some tests, you might want to just set this at 1920 by 1080 if you can afford to do that, or you can set this up at 50% where it's just, a small rendering just so you can see how the flow is working. So all you have to do that is if you go up here to view, then go down here to viewport render animation. If you click that, it will start to spit out a whole bunch of frames. Unless you've set this up to be a video file, which I don't recommend, I do recommend that you just do frames so you can sort of cycle through and see how it's working. It's going to then render out your viewport, however it is that you have it set up, and you'll be able to see how your simulation is getting along. Now, if you want to create the kind of effect that I'm showing in my animation that's playing on the screen right now, where you have a white background and it's more of a product render and you want it to be really nice and clean, where the particle effect of the water splash looks really sort of transparent and you can change the background to anything that you want. What you really need to do is you need to change a couple settings in your program. So you can see here if I go to the render properties here, and if I go down right here, I can turn off you can turn off your background by clicking this transparent button underneath film. But then what you can also do is you can change this to where the refraction, we can make this transparent glass. And what that does is anywhere that there's that really, really dark section where it's pulling the background in, you can change that to be transparent so that instead of it pulling that background HDRI when you want to do a background replacement, it basically creates an alpha channel. So that when you render this out and you do your compositing, you can then put a background replacement in very easily with using the alpha channel and you won't run into any major problems and you can change the background to be whatever you want. You might not get that refraction look where if you wanted the background to be sort of distorted by it. However, it will allow you to make a very solid color in the back where you can change that color, make it white, make it black, whatever it is that you want, and you have a lot more versatility in your final composition. So, if you are a avid user of this program or if you're a beginner, you might have gotten really really lost in understanding all of the stuff about bounces here. And some of you may have never messed with these at all. And really, what this is a way of trying to calculate how detailed you want the light paths to be rendered in your scene. Now, you can see here it's very noisy as it is. We have a lot of dots everywhere, and that's because I have a subsurface scattering done for the apple here. And you can see that with the water, there's a lot of graininess down in here. Now, you could do some other things like denoising to help with some of that, but some things like this, you just need more samples. So, in order to reduce the amount of samples you need to render your scene, you might want to take your max bounces and just sort of tick these down. However, what you really want to do is use the fast GI approximation, which are in all of the newest builds of Blender. And what this does is it basically does some fast approximation of those bounces so that you don't have your either CPU or your GPU waste its time trying to calculate the 100% realness, and it just approximates some of that stuff so that you can get a quicker render out with as little samples as possible. So just to show you how this works, if I go here to the render bounces, make sure that you have this set to 0 if you're a beginner, because you'll forget to change this to equal the viewport if you like what the viewport is. But if we take this viewport here and we change this to a 1, you can see how dark the scene got. But you can see also that this is less noisy. Everything has become less noisy. It's darker, but there is this was able to render a lot faster, this sort of image here. And when we throw a denoise on this, it won't look as muddled and weird, and we won't see as many issues with the denoising if we were to render this out versus something that had more bounces. Now, this is too dark, so we'd have to tick this up a couple times, but you can see that even with that first tick up to the second right there, this number 2, you can see that it instantly made everything brighter. It does take more time to render a more clean image, but you can see that it is brightening up the image. And the more we tick this up, the brighter some of these areas that were dark will get, and the more detailed we're going to get as far as the overall render pass. If we go over here to the render settings and you go down the list of color management, most of you have only used this to change this to the view transform of Filmic. Now, what you want to do is change this to false color. And what this does is it's going to show you areas that are not going to be calculated as far as the color value. And to sort of like simplify this as best as I can without getting too complex, is that if I look at my light here and I change the setting to, let's say, 1000, you can see all this red right here. And if I go back here to the color management and I change it from false color to Filmic, it looks nice and white right now. But when we do a final render, this is going to be a blown out white color. And it's a little bit easier to see if I change this to standard. You can see how totally white that is. When we start to composite this, those values are going to be really far beyond what a regular white is, and it's going to be what's called blown out. And you're going to have trouble then changing the contrast because there's not enough light information in there. There's not enough information in these areas to really control how the highlights are being cast and how you can change the coloring and stuff. And some of this you'll just have to trust me on. But if we then change this back from standard to false color, and you take your area light back here and we change it back to 300, you can see that now I have a yellow color here, and you can see where the areas are mixing. We do have a little bit of this blown out color right here. You can see the red right there, and a couple areas right here and right here. But you're going to get a better control of your scene by reducing those really bright hotspots as much as possible. And what you'll notice is that that may darken your scene. You might have started with some really bright lights, which, show off how bright this fluid can be. But after a while, you're going to notice that when you start to do some compositing effects and stuff like that, and you really want to control how this is being composited, you want to reduce as much as possible those really bright points so that you can have total control of your image in post production. The last thing I'm going to show you here has to do with your compositing. So you can see here that I have the image in the background here. And if I look at it, you can see that there's the noisy image right here. If I go to the view and I click this to fit, you should be able to see some noise. Let's zoom in a little bit more. You can see that there's a lot of noise right in here. So I turned on the denoiser. If you don't know how to do that, there's a lot of tutorials on how to do that. It's just a button press in the render settings over here. If you go to denoising, you can click on the adaptive sampling to help you save time, and then over here you can change this to open image denoiser or whatever it is that you have. But you can see here, really nice clean image after the denoise, and when it's zoomed out to what it would properly be like, you can see that there's not as much of that weird sort of denoising effect happening there, and in the final render it looks pretty nice. So what we'll want to do here is you want to do a background replacement. So if I click the over here, you can see that there's the alpha right here. I have an alpha export. And if I have this right here, a color mix node, and I have the image put into here, and I have the alpha put into the factor, and we take a look here, you can see that you have a really nice background replacement just right away, okay? So that's how you can do a quick background replacement. I would recommend that if you're doing one frame, you want to do it this way. If you're doing an animation, you want to render out an EXR sequence first and then do this in post. And then from there, you can add a glare node right here like this, which will add a little bit of a glow effect, which you could have seen added in right in here. But you can see that because my image is not blown out, it's not overtaking the entire scene, which does tend to happen when people don't make sure that they follow that step where you look at the false color information. And then, of course, you want to do a final color balance. So if we look at this here, you can see that I've added a color balance node, which allows me to control those brights, to pop those up, change the coloring, change the way that everything sort of looks with these, basically coloring my film here. And I can then add a lens distortion at the very end, whoops, if that's what I want to do, which then allows that sort of effect there. And from there, I can basically go into my render, change this to the viewer node, and I can save out this image. So that's going to be it for this tutorial. Hopefully you learned something about fluid simulations. If you haven't yet, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps me out a lot, and I will see you all next time on DJ Tutorials.